50 feet above the Bismarck Sea, a 23-year-old Australian pilot discovers there's something worse than combat. Look, combat is terrifying. You can die at any moment. Flak punches holes through aluminum. Zeros drop out of the sun with their cannons blazing. Your hands shake on the controls, and your mouth goes dry, and every second feels like your last. But combat has this mercy built into it. The enemy's trying to kill you too, right? There's a transaction happening, an exchange of violence. You can tell yourself it's fair. March 4th, 1943 isn't fair. The debris field stretches 15 square miles across the Huon Gulf. From 2,000 feet, it looks like an oil slick with confetti scattered across it. Pieces of decking, lifeboats, barrels, bodies. But as the Beaufighter descends, the confetti becomes men. Thousands of them, floating, swimming, clinging to wreckage, waving. He's one of 13 Beaufighter pilots from No. 30 Squadron RAAF, the City of Sail Squadron, established at RAAF Base Richmond on March 9, 1942. Following Wing Commander John Blackjack Walker toward the debris, what matters is his age, 23, and his altitude, 50 feet, and his armament, 4 20mm Hispano cannon in the nose, 6 3.03-inch Browning machine guns in the wings, 240 rounds per cannon, 1,000 rounds per machine gun. The Beaufighter's theoretical rate of fire is approximately 1,000 rounds per minute combined. At 200 miles per hour and 50 feet above the water, he has approximately 2.5 seconds of firing time per pass. He can't miss. That's the horror. But to understand what's happening in that cockpit, to understand why this pilot will spend decades unable to swim in the ocean, you have to understand why nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers were floating in the Bismarck Sea in the first place. You have to understand desperation. And you have to understand that the men in the water were just as young, just as scared, just as certain they were doing their duty as the men flying above them. By December 1942, Japan was losing New Guinea. The defeats at Buna and Gona on the Kokoda track had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle warfare. Australian troops, exhausted, disease-ridden, fighting through terrain so brutal that more men died of sickness than combat. They'd fought the Japanese to a standstill, then pushed them back, then killed them in their bunkers, one by one, with grenades and flamethrowers and raw determination. The garrison at Lae, the last major Japanese stronghold on the New Guinea coast, was bleeding men and supplies. Without reinforcement, it'd fall within months. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo issued the order: reinforce Lae. Send the 51st Division, a veteran infantry unit, across the Bismarck Sea from Rabaul. 6,912 soldiers. Enough to hold Lae. Enough to extend the war. The soldiers of the 51st Division were professionals. Many had fought in China. They understood what awaited them in New Guinea. The jungle, the disease, the Australians who fought like men possessed. But they were soldiers. They followed orders. They boarded transport ships at Simpson Harbour, Rabaul, on the evening of February 28, 1943, and they settled into holds that smelled of diesel fuel and sweat and fear, and they prepared themselves for combat. What they got instead was 3 days of terror, followed by a morning of slaughter. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding the southeastern fleet at Rabaul, knew the mathematics of this operation. He'd seen the reconnaissance reports. Allied air power had grown substantially since the early months of the war. American B-17 and B-24s, Australian Beaufighters and Bostons, fighters in numbers that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force controlled the skies over the Bismarck Sea during daylight hours. Any convoy crossing that water would be exposed for 3 days, 72 hours of vulnerability. Kusaka advocated for an alternative. Land the troops at a distant point on the New Guinea coast and have them march overland to Lae. 200 miles of swamp, mountain and jungle without established roads. It would take weeks. Hundreds would die of disease and exhaustion before reaching the garrison. Malaria, dysentery, starvation, the 1,000 small deaths the jungle dealt to men who tried to cross it on foot. But they'd get there alive. Enough of them would get there alive. Tokyo rejected this. Too slow, too inefficient. The convoy would sail. So the Japanese planned the crossing for late February, timing it with the monsoon season, hoping cloud cover would shield them from Allied reconnaissance. They selected a route hugging the northern coast of New Britain, maximising the distance from Allied airfields in Papua New Guinea. They assigned 8 destroyers to escort the 8 transports. Shirayuki as flagship, with Arashio, Asashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami and Shikinami providing the screen. They requested fighter coverage from the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul. Zeros would fly overhead. The convoy would be protected. And they prayed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the Americans were reading their mail. Ultra, the greatest secret of the Second World War. American and British codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval codes, and by February 1943, Allied intelligence knew almost as much about Operation 81 as Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura himself. They knew the convoy's composition: 8 transports, 8 destroyers. They knew its departure date, February 28th. They knew its route, around Cape Gloucester, through the Dampier Strait into Huon Gulf. General George Churchill Kenny received the intelligence reports at 5th Air Force Headquarters in Port Moresby. Short, stocky, with a Boston accent despite his Canadian birth, Kenny had been commanding Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific since July 1942. He'd inherited a demoralized force and transformed it into an aggressive striking arm through sheer force of will and a willingness to adopt unconventional tactics. Kenny immediately began preparations for the intercept. Every available bomber, every available fighter, and a new weapon the Japanese had never seen. A weapon born from one man's mechanical genius and personal rage. Skip bombing. To understand Pappy Gunn, you have to understand what happens to a man when the Japanese take his family. Major Paul Irvin Gunn was 42 years old in 1943, ancient by combat pilot standards. A former Navy pilot who'd become a civilian airline captain in the Philippines, he'd been flying the Manila to Davao route when the Japanese invaded in December 1941. He escaped the Philippines in a damaged aircraft held together by wire and determination. His wife and 4 children didn't escape. They were interned at Santo Tomas prison camp in Manila, where they'd remain for the duration of the war. For nearly 4 years, Gunn's family lived behind barbed wire. Starvation rations, disease, the casual brutality of guards who saw prisoners as subhuman. Gunn knew all of this. He received fragmentary reports through intelligence channels, and he could do nothing about it except fly combat missions with a fury that unnerved even his fellow pilots. He reportedly said after one mission, "We got most of them." He meant it literally. Every Japanese soldier he killed was payment against a debt that could never be repaid. Every bomb, every bullet, every burning ship brought him fractionally closer to the day when he might hold his children again. But personal rage, however intense, doesn't win wars. Gun's genius was mechanical improvisation, the ability to look at an aircraft designed for one purpose and see how it could be transformed into something entirely different. The B-25 Mitchell was a perfectly adequate medium bomber. Twin engines, crew of 6, capable of carrying 3,000 pounds of ordnance at respectable speed and altitude. Designed for level bombing from 8 to 10,000 feet. A workmanlike aircraft that did its job competently and without distinction. Gunn looked at the B-25 and saw a flying gun platform. Working at a depot in Townsville, Australia, Gunn personally supervised the modification of B-25s into something the original designers would barely recognize. He removed the bombardier position from the nose, the glass greenhouse where a man would typically crouch over a Norden bomb site, calculating windage and altitude and drop angles. In its place, Gunn installed a solid nose packed with firepower. 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, their muzzles protruding like the fangs of some mechanical predator. 8 50s, each one firing at approximately 800 rounds per minute, each round weighing 1.7 ounces and travelling at 2,900 feet per second. The combined rate of fire was roughly 6,400 rounds per minute. A wall of lead that could shred a ship's deck crew, silence anti-aircraft positions, and turn exposed soldiers into casualties in a single pass. But guns weren't enough to sink ships. Bullets could kill men, but they couldn't punch through steel hulls and reach the waterline where ships were vulnerable. Gunn needed bombs that could penetrate, and that meant solving a problem that had plagued low-altitude bombers since the beginning of aviation. Drop a bomb from 10,000 feet, and you had time for a proper aiming solution. The bombardier made his calculations, adjusted for windage and airspeed and altitude, released at the optimal moment, and the bomb fell for 30 seconds before impact. Accuracy was relative. You might hit within 100 yards of your target. But the ship couldn't maneuver fast enough to matter, and the bomb fell nearly vertically into whatever it struck. Drop a bomb from 200 feet, and everything changed. No time for calculations, no proper aiming solution. And if you released conventionally, the bomb would arc downward and detonate directly beneath your aircraft, killing you along with your target. Low-altitude bombing was effectively suicide, unless you changed the geometry. Gunn's solution was elegant, almost playful. Don't drop the bomb, skip it. Approaching at 200 feet and 300 miles per hour, the modified B-25 would release its bombs at approximately 100 yards from the target. The bombs, standard 500-pounders equipped with 5-second delayed action fuses, would strike the water at a shallow angle and skip across the surface like stones across a pond. 1 skip, 2. Then impact against the ship's hull at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse was critical. The bomb wouldn't explode on contact with the water. It'd keep skipping, keep travelling, until it punched through the hull and detonated inside the ship. Below the waterline, where it mattered. Gunn practiced the technique on wrecked ships in Port Moresby Harbour, refining the altitude, the airspeed, the release point. Too high, and the bomb wouldn't skip properly. Too low, and you'd fly into your own debris. Too close, and the explosion might catch your aircraft. Too far, and you'd miss entirely. The window was narrow, but it was there. By February 1943, Gunn had trained enough pilots to form a credible strike force. The 5th Air Force had a weapon the Japanese didn't know existed. And then the convoy sailed. February 28, 1943, approximately 2,200 hours local time. Simpson Harbour, Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of destroyer Shirayuki as the convoy formed up in the darkness. Behind him, 8 transport ships: Ayo Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Teiyo Maru, Kembu Maru, and Nojima Maru. In their holds, 6,912 soldiers of the 51st Division, packed into spaces designed for half that number, breathing recycled air that smelled of oil and bodies and fear. 7 more destroyers took their escort positions. The convoy began to move. Kimura knew the odds. He'd been briefed on Allied air strength, on the sighting aircraft that would certainly spot them, on the narrow window between detection and destruction. His convoy could make 7 knots, the maximum sustainable speed of the slowest transports. At 7 knots, crossing the Bismarck Sea would take 3 days. 3 days exposed. But the monsoon clouds were thick overhead, and the weather forecast promised continued cover, and perhaps they'd slip through. Convoys had made the crossing before, not often, not easily, but it was possible. The convoy carried not only soldiers, but drums of aviation fuel, artillery pieces, ammunition, medical supplies, and provisions estimated sufficient to sustain the Leh garrison for 6 months. If it arrived, the New Guinea campaign would extend by months, perhaps a year. Thousands of Allied soldiers would die, assaulting positions that should have fallen by summer. The mathematics of war would shift in Japan's favour. If. March 1st, 1943. The convoy rounded Cape Gloucester and entered the Bismarck Sea proper. Weather conditions held, heavy overcast, intermittent rain squalls, visibility measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The transports ploughed through moderate swells, while their destroyer escorts swept the perimeter, watching for submarines, watching for aircraft, watching for anything that moved. At 1500 hours, a B-24 Liberator of the 91st Bombardment Group broke through the cloud cover 50 miles north of Cape Gloucester. The pilot, Lieutenant Walter Higgins, caught a glimpse of shapes on the water before Japanese Zeros scrambled to intercept. He got a fragmentary radio message out. Convoy spotted, approximate position, heading southeast, before diving back into the clouds and running for Port Moresby. The message was enough. Kenny had his target. March 2nd was conventional combat, the kind of warfare both sides understood. 8 B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 43rd Bombardment Group, led by Major Ed Scott, attacked from medium altitude, approximately 6,500 feet. Standard-level bombing technique, the bombardiers crouched over their northern sights, calculating, adjusting, releasing at the optimal moment. The transports began evasive maneuvers, their captains spinning wheels and shouting orders, trying to read where the bombs would fall and be somewhere else when they arrived. At 08:25 hours, 1 bomb struck Kyokusei Maru amidships. The explosion ripped through the transport's hull, but the ship stayed afloat, badly wounded, taking on water, but not sinking. Not yet. Over the next 3 hours, the crew organized an evacuation. 950 soldiers of the 51st Division transferred to destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo, climbing down cargo nets and rope ladders into boats that ferried them across the swells. By 1100 hours, Kyokusei Maru was empty of living men. She sank an hour later, her bow rising briefly before sliding under. Yukikaze and Asagumo, crowded with survivors, separated from the convoy and ran for Leh at 30 knots. They arrived that evening and disembarked their troops in darkness. Those 950 soldiers were the only substantial reinforcement that would reach Leh from Operation 81. That night, at Port Moresby, Kenny reviewed weather forecasts. March 3rd. Clearing skies, unlimited visibility, calm seas. The monsoon was breaking. The clouds that had protected the convoy would dissipate overnight, leaving the Japanese naked under blue sky. Kenny issued the attack order. Maximum effort, every available aircraft, 90 bombers, 130 fighters, and the modified B-25s, Pappy guns creation, their solid noses packed with guns and their bomb bays loaded for skip bombing. March 3rd was the massacre. At 07:58 hours, Wing Commander John "Blackjack" Walker led 13 Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron toward the convoy at wave top height. Walker was a career RAAF officer who'd been flying combat operations in New Guinea since mid-1942. Known for leading from the front, his aircraft was always in the first wave, always taking the same risks he asked his pilots to take. The Beaufighters flew in a loose, line-abreast formation, their engines roaring just above the swells, spray kicking up behind them. To the Japanese lookouts, they presented the profile of torpedo bombers, twin-engine aircraft approaching at sea level, exactly how torpedo attacks began. The convoy reacted exactly as trained. Ships turned to present their bows, the narrowest possible target, to the approaching aircraft. Standard anti-torpedo doctrine. Minimize the target area. Give the bombardier the smallest possible aim point. This was exactly what Walker wanted. By turning bow on, the Japanese ships presented their bridge structures and deck crews to the Beaufighters' strafing runs. Superstructures that rose high above the waterline. Anti-aircraft positions manned by exposed gunners. Command centers with glass windows and unarmored walls. At 0802, the Beaufighters opened fire at approximately 500 yards range. The noise was beyond description. 4 20mm Hispano cannon and 6.303-inch Brownings per aircraft, all firing simultaneously. The sound merging into a single continuous roar that vibrated through the airframe and penetrated the pilots' skulls despite their helmets. The cockpit filled with the smell of cordite, sharp and chemical, burning the back of the throat. Spent brass cascaded through ejection ports. The aircraft shuddered with recoil. 13 Beaufighters. Theoretical combined weight of fire, approximately 10,140 pounds per minute. In a single pass, lasting maybe 3 seconds per ship, they swept the convoy's upper works with a storm of steel. Bridge windows shattered. Men died at their posts, cut down before they could react. Anti-aircraft gunners, the men whose job was to defend against exactly this kind of attack, were killed or wounded before they could traverse their weapons. On ship after ship, command capability evaporated in seconds. And then the B-25s arrived, modified by Pappy gun, armed with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns each. Approaching at 200 feet, close enough to see individual sailors scrambling across decks, close enough to pick targets among the chaos. They opened fire at 300 yards, the 850s creating a cone of destruction that walked across the water and up the hulls of the transports ahead. At 100 yards they released. The bombs dropped from the B-25's bellies, falling the short distance to the water, striking at shallow angles, skipping once, twice, 3 times across the surface. They struck the transport hulls at or below the waterline. The 5-second fuses clicked down to 0. Teo Maru erupted from inside. A geyser of fire and debris shot skyward as the bomb detonated within her hull, the explosion finding fuel stores and ammunition and the 1,000 flammable things a ship carries. She began to sink immediately, her back broken, her bow and stern rising at impossible angles as her center collapsed into the sea. Oigawa Maru was next, then Shinai Maru, then Taimei Maru. The destroyers tried to lay smoke screens, their crews throwing chemical canisters over the side, grey fog billowing across the water to hide the surviving transports. They tried to provide covering fire, their anti-aircraft guns barking at aircraft that flew too low and too fast for the weapons to track effectively. A few Japanese fighters from the 11th Air Fleet engaged the attackers, but they were outnumbered, and their high-altitude interception tactics were useless against enemies that flew at 50 feet. By noon, 7 of 8 transports were sinking or sunk. 4 destroyers, Shirayuki, Arashio, Asashio, Tokitsukaze, were gone. The battle was over. Allied losses: 4 aircraft shot down, approximately 10 damaged. But the survivors were still floating. By sunset on March 3rd, the debris field stretched across 15 square miles of ocean. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors floated in the oily water, clinging to debris, lifeboats, each other. Oil fires burned on the surface, patches of flame that drifted with the current, illuminating clusters of men who pushed away from the heat as best they could. The water was warm. This was the equatorial Pacific, but warm water kills slowly. Exhaustion, dehydration, the slow sapping of strength as hours passed and rescue didn't come. Japanese submarines were dispatched from Rabaul. They wouldn't arrive until the following day. Surviving destroyers Uranami and Shikinami withdrew toward Rabaul with approximately 2,700 survivors aboard. Men pulled from the water before the destroyers fled. But thousands more remained, treading water, praying, waiting. That night at Port Moresby, General George Kenny made a decision. The operational justification was explicit. Survivors who reached the New Guinea shore would join the Lae garrison. Every Japanese soldier in the water was one more rifle defending Lae when Australian troops came ashore. Kill them now or kill them later at greater cost. Kenny wrote it plainly in his 1949 autobiography, General Kenny Reports. We sent them out to mop up. The nips were still floating around in the water, and we didn't want them rescued and taken to Lae. The order was issued at approximately 0700 on March 4th. Return to the debris field. Engage survivors. The pilots of No. 30 Squadron RAAF received their orders in the briefing hut at Port Moresby. The room was quiet. No one asked questions. No one needed to. They understood what engage survivors meant. They understood the difference between what they'd done yesterday, combat, with flak and zeros and ships shooting back, and what they were about to do today. Our pilot climbed into his Beaufighter with his navigator. He was 23 years old. Before the war, he might have been a bank clerk or a university student or a farmer's son from rural Victoria. The records don't say exactly who he was, just another name on a squadron roster. Another young man who'd volunteered for something he couldn't have imagined until he was living it. His navigator settled into his position behind and below the pilot's seat, facing rearward. The navigator's job was navigation, obviously, plotting courses, tracking fuel consumption, keeping the aircraft on heading. But his station also gave him a view the pilot didn't have. He could see backward. He could see what they left behind. The engine started. The Beaufighter rolled down the runway, lifted off, banked north toward Huon Gulf. 40 minutes of flight time. 40 minutes of silence between two men who knew what was coming. The longest flight of his life. And nothing was shooting at him. At 0800 hours, the Beaufighters descended. Here's the thing. At 20,000 feet, bombing a factory, there's abstraction. You press a button. The payload falls for 30 seconds. Impact is a puff of smoke on the ground you can barely see. The bombardier never sees the bodies. The destruction exists on a different plane of reality, theoretical, statistical, distant. You can call it war and mean it. But at 50 feet, strafing a man clinging to driftwood, you see everything. The pilot levels off above the debris field. The oil slick stretches to the horizon, iridescent in the morning light, patches of rainbow color where petroleum compounds spread across the surface. Bodies float face down in clusters. Men who died during the night, from wounds or exhaustion or despair, their uniforms dark against the blue-black water. But among the bodies, there's movement. Arms waving, heads turning. Men who've survived 18 hours in the water and are watching the aircraft descend. They know what's coming. He can see them watching. Through the canopy glass, scratched, salt-sprayed, smeared with oil from yesterday's passes, the pilot sees faces, individual faces. Young men, his age or younger, wearing what remains of Japanese army uniforms. Some are wounded, dark stains spreading from bandages that haven't been changed in a day. Some are helping others stay afloat, supporting men too weak to swim alone. Some are just floating, exhausted, barely alive, watching the sky with eyes that have stopped expecting rescue. For one moment, before the cannon starts firing, they're just two men looking at each other across 50 feet of salt air. One floating, one flying. Close enough to see each other's expressions. Close enough to be human to each other. Then the pilot's thumb finds the button. The four 20mm Hispano cannon fire at 600 rounds per minute each. The vibration shudders through the airframe, through the stick, through his arm. The smell of cordite fills the cockpit instantly, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. The 6.303-inch Brownings add another 6,000 rounds per minute combined, their lighter chatter merging with the deeper thunder of the cannon into a wall of sound that drowns out everything else. At 50 feet and 200 miles per hour, he has approximately 2.5 seconds of firing time per pass before he overshoots the target. He can't miss. At this range, missing is geometrically impossible. The first pass is the worst, because it's the first. He lines up on a cluster of men, 20, maybe 30, clinging to a piece of decking that used to be a transport ship. At 200 yards, he opens fire. The cannon shells churn the water into white foam streaked with red. At 50 yards, he's still firing. At 10 yards, he pulls up, hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as the bowfighter clears the debris by feet. He doesn't look back. He can't. The bowfighter's cockpit only looks forward, but his navigator looks back. The navigator's station faces rearward. His job is to watch for pursuing fighters, to monitor what's behind them, to be the pilot's eyes where the pilot can't see. Now he sees something no training prepared him for. He sees the cluster dissolve. He sees bodies floating where men were swimming moments before. He sees the water change color, darker, spreading, diffusing. The navigator doesn't say anything. There's nothing to say. The second pass is worse because now the pilot knows what it looks like. The cluster is gone. Some bodies float motionless, face down, arms spread. Others thrash weakly, wounded, dying, unable to do anything but move. A few survivors try to swim away from where the aircraft is banking for another run. The pilot realizes with this sick lurch that he's going to have to track them individually now. Line up on swimmers, single targets in an ocean of debris. His thumb finds the button again. Between passes, while the bowfighter repositions, there's a moment of terrible clarity. From 500 feet, the pilot can see the entire debris field, patches of red that spread and fade in the current. Bodies floating in clusters, men still alive, still treading water, still watching the airplanes circle back. Some of them duck underwater when he approaches. They come back up gasping because they can't hold their breath forever, and he has enough fuel to wait. The mission lasts somewhere between 90 minutes and 3 hours. Different sources estimate different durations. The pilots don't remember exactly. Time stops working properly when you're doing something like this. The minutes stretch and compress in ways that have nothing to do with clocks. What they remember is running out of ammunition. 240 rounds per cannon, 1,000 rounds per machine gun, all of it gone. And the strange emptiness of making passes over survivors with nothing left to shoot. They remember the faces. Men who raised their hands, men whose mouths opened in sounds the pilots couldn't hear over engine noise, but could imagine perfectly. Men who just floated there, waiting, too exhausted to swim, too exhausted to dive, watching death descend. PT boats from Motor Torpedo Boat Squadrons 12 and 21 arrived in the debris field around 1000 hours. Their original mission was search and rescue for downed Allied aircrew. Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, commanding the PT boat flotilla, later reported engaging targets of opportunity. Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 arrived that afternoon. Over the following 48 hours, they rescued approximately 200 to 300 survivors, men who'd floated for 2 days, who'd watched their comrades die around them, who'd somehow lasted long enough for rescue that almost didn't come. Several hundred more managed to swim or drift to the New Guinea coast, where they joined the Ley garrison or were captured by Allied forces over subsequent weeks. Of the 6,912 Japanese soldiers who departed Rabaul on February 28th, approximately 2,890 died. Most drowned or were killed on March 3rd during the convoy attack itself. But hundreds, the exact number was never established, never recorded, never officially counted, died on March 4th in the debris field under the guns of aircraft that couldn't miss. The Beaufighter climbs, turns south. Port Moresby is 40 minutes away. The pilot's hands are still on the controls, but he's not really flying. The aircraft is flying itself. Straight and level, steady heading. The kind of flying that requires no thought and no attention. His mind is still back over the debris field, still lining up, still pressing the button. His thumb keeps twitching against the stick where the trigger used to matter. His navigator says nothing. The silence in the cockpit has weight. It fills the space between them like something physical, something you could reach out and touch if you were foolish enough to try. There's nothing to say. What words would fit? Good work? Mission accomplished? The vocabulary that applied to March 3rd, destroying transports, sinking warships, real combat with real resistance. It doesn't apply to March 4th. They both know it. They both know the other knows it. 40 minutes is a long time when no one's talking. The Beaufighter lands at Port Moresby. The ground crew chief walks over, grinning, ready to hear about the mission, ready to congratulate another successful operation. The pilot climbs out of the cockpit, walks past him without speaking, reaches the edge of the runway, and vomits until his stomach's empty. That night, the officers' mess is full and completely silent. Men sit in clusters of 2 or 3, speaking in murmurs if they speak at all. Someone's coffee cup scrapes against a saucer, and the sound seems enormous. A pilot who just arrived from training, missed the battle entirely, keeps trying to start conversations that die after one sentence. He doesn't understand why no one wants to talk, why no one wants to drink, why men who just won the biggest aerial victory of the Pacific War are sitting in silence like they're at a funeral. But the men who flew that morning know something he doesn't. They know the difference between combat and execution. Combat is terrifying and exhilarating. You come back with stories, the Zero that almost got you, the flak burst that missed by inches, the transport that exploded when the bomb hit. Combat has a narrative structure. It's scary, and then it's over, and then you can shape it into something you can live with. Something you might tell your children someday. Execution is just terrifying. There are no stories, just a silence that started in the cockpit and spread to the mess hall, to the barracks, to the letters home that didn't mention what happened, to the rest of their lives. The order was legal. This matters. It shouldn't, but it does, because legality is the only shelter available when you're looking for a way to keep living with yourself. Under the rules of warfare, as understood in 1943, Japanese soldiers in the water, uninjured, capable of reaching shore, able to rejoin combat operations, remained combatants. They hadn't surrendered. They couldn't surrender from the water without a vessel to receive them and accept that surrender. They were reinforcements in transit, temporarily inconvenienced by the destruction of their transport, and engaging them wasn't, technically, murder. General Kenny understood this. The strategists understood this. The pilots understood this, in the abstract, before they descended to 50 feet. But the abstraction doesn't survive contact with reality. When you're close enough to see a man's eyes, the legal distinction between combatant in transit and drowning human being becomes meaningless. He's just a man, young, scared, trying to stay alive, just like you. The mission was justified. This matters too. Kenny's math was correct. Survivors who reached shore did join the Leh garrison. Australian troops of the 9th Division did fight them when they captured Leh in September 1943. Some Australians died fighting men who swam ashore from the debris field. Killing Japanese soldiers in the water saved Australian lives on land. But justified is a word for generals and historians. It's a word for decades later, when you're writing memoirs and explaining decisions to people who weren't there. In the cockpit, in the moment, justified is just noise. What's real is the face in the water. What's real is the button under your thumb. What's real is the choice you're making, right now, to press it. Wing Commander John Blackjack Walker was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership during the Bismarck Sea action. He continued his RAAF career after the war, retired as a group captain, died in 1996. No extensive interviews about March 4th have ever been located. That absence tells its own story. Pilots talked about combat. They talked about close calls, about victories, about the missions that tested them and the friends they lost and the enemies they respected. They wrote memoirs, they gave interviews, they told their children and grandchildren about the war. Almost no one talked about March 4th. General George Kenny wrote about it. He was a commander. Commanders have to explain their decisions, justify their orders, defend their legacies. In his 1949 autobiography, General Kenny reports, he defended the strafing on strategic grounds and never expressed doubt. But Kenny looked at maps and reports. He gave orders and monitored outcomes. He didn't look through gun sights. The pilots who did, the young men of number. 30 Squadron RAAF, the crews of the 38th and 91st Bombardment Groups, they went home when the war ended. They built lives, had children, had grandchildren, became bank managers and farmers and shopkeepers, and all the ordinary things people become when wars end and peace begins. And they carried something with them that they never discussed. Here's what we know about the psychological aftermath, pieced together from the fragments that survive in medical records and family testimonies, and the occasional interview given decades later to researchers who knew the right questions to ask. Veterans of the March 4th operations reported higher rates of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder than veterans of conventional combat missions. Sleep disturbances, nightmares that repeated the same sequences over and over, waking at 3 a.m., convinced they could smell burning oil. Hypervigilance, jumping at sounds, scanning for threats that weren't there. Avoidance behaviours, the inability to be near certain situations without experiencing intrusive memories. Some couldn't swim in the ocean. Some couldn't hear small aircraft without their hands shaking. Some sat in garages at 2 a.m., weeping in the dark when their families had been asleep for hours. The details vary, the pattern doesn't. Men who flew on March 4th carried something home that men who flew on March 3rd, the day of actual combat, often didn't. Combat was terrifying, but combat made sense. Combat had a structure you could live inside, a narrative you could tell yourself about threat and response and survival. March 4th didn't have that structure. March 4th was just killing, at 50 feet, with perfect visibility, until the ammunition ran out. That's the thing about moral injury. It doesn't care if you were right. It doesn't care if the order was legal, the mission justified, the strategy sound. It doesn't care if your commanding general wrote in his memoirs that you did exactly what needed doing. Moral injury is what happens when you violate your own sense of what's acceptable, your own internal code of who you are and what you're capable of, even if everyone around you says it was necessary. Your brain knows you did your duty. Your soul knows you killed drowning men. The two don't reconcile. They just coexist forever. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a decisive Allied victory. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers killed. The Japanese never attempted another major convoy operation within range of Allied land-based air power. After March 1943, all reinforcement of New Guinea garrisons was by submarine, barge, or aircraft, methods that could move only handfuls of troops at a time. April 1943. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo abandoned any plans to reinforce Leh by convoy. The strategic implications were profound. The war in New Guinea, which might have dragged on for another year, consuming tens of thousands of Allied lives, would effectively end by the fall. September 1943. Australian 9th Division captured Leh. The garrison, never reinforced to full strength after the Bismarck Sea disaster, couldn't resist the combined ground and amphibious assault. The survivors of the 51st Division who'd made it ashore fought and died defending positions that should have been held by 3 times their number. Pappy Gunn's skip bombing technique became standard doctrine. The Beaufighter pilots proved that low-altitude strafing could suppress a convoy's defences long enough for the bombers to work. The coordination between RAAF and USAAF aircraft became a model for future operations. From a military standpoint, everything worked exactly as planned. But victory doesn't feel like victory when you've seen what victory costs. The pilot who flew that morning came home. He lived another 5 decades, however long he was given. He raised children. He worked a job. He contributed to society. From the outside, he was fine. Normal. Quiet, maybe. A little distant sometimes, but fine. If you'd asked him what he did in the war, he would have said he flew Beaufighters. He would have said it was a long time ago. He wouldn't have said anything about March 4th. He wouldn't have explained why he never swam in the ocean anymore, why certain sounds made his hands shake, why he sometimes woke in darkness convinced he could hear screaming in a language he never learned. He wouldn't have told you about the silence that started in that cockpit 40 minutes from Port Moresby when he and his navigator realized they couldn't speak about what they'd done. The silence was the answer. The silence was all he could give to a question that had no good response. Some things you do in war become stories. You tell them at reunions. You tell them to your grandchildren. They become part of who you are, integrated into the narrative of your life. And some things you do in war are just silence. They don't become stories because there's no way to tell them that makes you sound like anything other than a monster or a victim, or both. They stay inside you, unspoken, for the rest of your life. You carry them alone because carrying them together would require words, and there are no words. March 4th, 1943, was silence. The order was legal. The mission was justified. The pilot did his duty. And part of him never left that cockpit, never finished that 40-minute flight home, never found the words that would let him stop being silent. That's the story nobody tells about victory. Subscribe for more stories like this.